Wild world of animals, life in zoos and preserves. From my father's library, very fascinating. It's Time Life Television. All information you can read from here. It is based on television series, and it is published by Timeline Films, and the editor is Gerald Osborne, and you can just go through this yourselves. Look at that. This is the ISBN number for you to see, and they have written the copyright from Menagerie, Manor by Gerald, Durrel, copyrights 1964 by Gerald, Durrel, is reprinted by permission of Viking Press Inc. and Curtis Brown Limited, and that's exactly what I'm going to read today. Very interesting as it is. I've read quite a bit of his short stories and essays. Very engaging. So from page 24 of the book I read the story Menagerie, Manor by Gerald Durrel. A little bit about him. You can see his photograph. An irrepressible collector of animals since childhood, Gerald Durrel, seen below with a leopard cub, had a lifelong dream of establishing a zoo of his own. In 1957, he realized that dream with the establishment of the Gerry Wildlife Preservation Trust on the island of Jersey in the English Channel. The trust is dedicated to the preservation of endangered species and is home to more than 500 animals, including Claudius, a South American tapir with a penchant for midnight peregrinations, roaming around. So, Menagerie Manor is a story of one such stroll. So, what is a tapir? They look like a sort of, rather, they are most closely related to horses and rhinos. They are huge, and they look a sort of like a cross between an elephant and a hippo. And these are huge, large, herbivorous mammals. They are similar in shape to a pig with a short-nosed trunk, and they inhabit South and Central America. And currently, they are an endangered species. So, with his engaging style, Gerald writes the story. There are again some creatures, of course, which when they manage to escape, present you with considerable problems. For instance, there was the night I shall never forget when Claudius, the South American tapir, contrived to find a way out of his paddock. The person who had been in to give him his night feed had padlocked the gate carefully, but without sliding the bolt into position. Claudius, having a nocturnal perambulation round his territory, found to his delight that the gate, which he had hitherto presumed to be invulnerable, now responded to his gentle nosings. He decided that this was a very suitable night to have a short intrusion into the neighboring countryside. It was a suitable night from Claudius's point of view, because the skies were as black as pitch, and the rain was streaming down in torrents that I have rarely seen equalled outside the tropics. It was about 11:15, and we were all on the point of going to bed when a rather harassed and extremely wet motorist appeared and beat upon the front door. Above the roar of the rain, He said that he had just seen a big animal in the headlights of his car, which he felt sure must be one of ours. I asked him what it looked like, and he said it looked like a misshapen um, pony with an elephant's trunk. My heart sank, for I knew just how far and how fast Claudius could gallop if given half a chance. I was in my shirt sleeves and only wearing slippers, but there was no time to change into more suitable attire against the weather, for the motorist had spotted Claudius in a field adjoining our property, and I wanted to catch up with him before he ventured too far afield. I rushed round to the cottage and hurried all those members of the staff who lived in. In various stages of night attire, they all tumbled out into the rain, and we headed for the field into which the motorist assured us our taper had disappeared. This was quite a large field and belonged to our nearest neighbor, Leonard Defoe. Leonard had proved himself to be the most long-suffering and sympathetic of neighbors, and so I was determined that Claudius was not going to do any damage to his property if we could possibly avoid it. Having made this mental resolve, I then remembered to my horror that the field in which Claudius was reputedly lurking had just recently been carefully planted out by Leonard with anemones. I could imagine what Claudius's 400 weight could do to those carefully planted rows of delicate plants, particularly as, owing to his short-sightedness, his sense of direction was never too good as the best of times. Too good at the best of times. We reached the field soaked to the skin and surrounded it. There, sure enough, stood Claudius, obviously having the best evening out he had had in years. The weather, as far as he was concerned, was ideal. There was nothing quite like a heavy downpour of rain to make life worthwhile. He was standing there looking like a debauched Roman emperor under a shawl, meditatively masticating a large bunch of animals. So we see Claudius the tapir was masticating a large bunch of anemones. When it's pronounced like that, you can call it whatever, anemones. These are small plants, a beautiful, delicate flowers it has. When he saw us, he uttered his greeting, a ridiculous high-pitched squeak similar to the noise of a wet fighter being rubbed over a balloon. It was quite plain that he was delighted to see us and hoped that we would join him in his nocturnal ramble. But none of us was feeling in any mood to do this. We were drenched to the skin and freezing cold, and our one ambition was to get Claudius back into his paddock with as little trouble as possible. Uttering a despairing and rather futile cry of "Don't tread on the plants," I marshaled my band of tapir catchers, and we converged on Claudius in a grim-faced body. Okay. Claudius took one look at us and decided from our manner and bearing that we did not see eye to eye with him on the subject of gambling around in other people's field at 11:30 on a wet night, and so he felt that, albeit reluctantly, he would have to leave us. Pausing only to snatch another mouthful of anemones, he set off across the field at a sharp gallop, leaving a trail of destruction behind him that could only have been emulated by a runaway bulldozer. In our slippered feet, clotted with mud, we stumbled upon him. Our speed was reduced not only by the mud but by the fact that we were trying to run between the rows of flowers instead of on them. I remember making a mental note as I ran that I would ask Leonard in future to plant his rows of flowers wider apart, as this would facilitate the recapture of any animal that escaped. The damage Claudius had done to the flowers was bad enough, but worse was to follow. He suddenly swerved, and instead of running into the next field as we had hoped, for it was a grazing meadow, he ran straight into Leonardo's back garden. We pulled up short and stood panting, the rain trickling off us in torrents. "For God's sake," I said to everyone in general, "get that bloody animal out of that garden before he wrecks it." The words were hardly out of my mouth when from inside the garden came a series of tinkling crashes which told us too clearly that Claudius, trotting along in his normal myopic fashion, had ploughed his way through all Leonardo's clutches. Now, cloches is a bell-shaped or a dome-shaped cover made of glass or plastic, which is used to cover small outdoor plants from frost, etc. So before we could do anything sensible, Claudius, having decided that Leonardo's garden was not to his liking, crashed his way through a hedge, leaving a gaping hole in what hitherto had been a nice piece of topiary, and set off into the night at a brisk trot. The direction he was taking presented yet another danger, for he was heading straight for our small lake. Tapirs in the wild state are very fond of water, and they are excellent swimmers and can submerge themselves for a considerable length of time. The thought of having to search for a tapir in a quarter of an acre of dark water on a pitch black rainy night made the thought of hunting for a needle in a haystack pale into insignificance. This thought struck the other members of my band at the same moment, and we ran as we had never run before, and just succeeded at the very last minute in heading off Claudius. Coming up close to his rotund behind, I launched myself in a flying tackle and, more by luck than judgment, managed to grab him by one hind leg. In 30 seconds, I was wishing that I had not. Claudius kicked out and caught me a glancing blow on the side of the head, which made me see stars, and then revved up to a gallop, dragging me through the mud. But by now I was so wet, so cold, so muddy, and so angry that I clung on with determination of a limpet in a storm. My tenacity was rewarded, for my dragging weight slowed Claudius down sufficiently to allow the others to catch up, and they hurled themselves on various portions of his anatomy. The chief difficulty with a tapir is that there is practically nothing on which to hold. The ears are small and provide a precarious grip. The tail is minute, there is no mane, so really the only part you can grip with any degree of success are its legs, and Claudius's legs were fat and slippery with rain. However, we all clung on grimly while he bucked and kicked and snorted indignantly. As one person loosened his hold, another one would grab on until eventually Claudius decided he was using the wrong method of discouragement. He stopped pirouetting about, thought to himself for a moment, and then just simply lay down and looked at us. We stood round him in a sodden, exhausted circle and looked at each other. There were 5 of us and 400 weight of reluctant tapir. It was beyond our prowess to carry him, and yet it was quite obvious that Claudius had no intention of helping us in any way. He lay there with a mulish expression on his face. If we wanted to get him back to the zoo, it implied we would jolly well have to carry him. We had no more reinforcements to call on, so it appeared that we had reached an impasse. However, as Claudius was prepared to be stubborn, I was prepared to be equally so. I sent one of my dripping team back to the zoo for a row. I should of course have brought this very necessary adjunct of capture with me, but In my innocence, I had assumed that Claudius could be shivered back to his paddock with no more trouble than a domestic goat. When the rope arrived, we attached it firmly round Claudius's neck, making sure that it was not a slip knot, sorry. Otherwise, he would have been strangled, right? I thought one wrenched member of the staff was heard to mutter that a slip knot would be ideal. Then two of us took hold of the rope, two more took hold of his ears, and the fifth took hold of his hind legs. And by the application of considerable exertion, we raised him to his feet and wheelbarrowed him all of 10 feet before we collapsed again. We had a short pause to regain our breath and started off again. Once more, we carted him for about 10 feet, in the process of which I lost a slipper and had my hand heavily trodden on by one of the larger and weightier members of my team. We rested again, sitting dejectedly and panting in the rain, longing for a cigarette and unanimously deciding that the tapers were animal that should never in any circumstances have been invented. The field in which these operations took place was large and muddy. At the hour of night, under the stinging rain, it resembled an ancient tank training ground which had been abandoned because the tanks could no longer get through it. The mud in it appeared to have a glue-like quality not found elsewhere in the island of Jersey. It took us an hour and a half to get Claudius out of that field, and at the end of it, we felt rather like those people must have felt who erected Stonehenge, and none of us ruptured was a miracle. See the wit with which he writes. Stonehenge is a prehistoric ruin in South England on Salisbury Plain. It was constructed over the period of roughly 3000 to 1600 BC, one of the most important megalithic monuments in Europe. Of course, it's believed to have had religious and astronomical purposes. So basically, it is a huge thing. So he writes, Claudius, and at the end of it, we felt rather like those people must have felt who erected the Stonehenge, that none of us was ruptured for a miracle. A final colossal effort, and we hauled Claudius out of the field and over the boundary into the zoo. Here we were going to pause for further recuperation, but Claudius decided that since we had brought him back into the zoo grounds and would, it appeared, inevitably return him to his paddock, it would be silly to delay. He suddenly rose to his feet and took off like a rocket, all of us desperately clinging to various parts of his body. It seems ludicrous that for an hour and a half we should have been making the valiant attempt to get him to move at all, and now we were clinging to his fat body in an effort to slow him down for fear that in his normal blundering way he would run full tilt into one of the granite archways and hurt or perhaps even kill himself. We clung to him like suckerfish to a speeding shark, and to our intense relief managed to steer our irritating vehicle back into its paddock without any further mishap. And so we returned to our respective bedrooms, bruised, cold, and covered with mud. I had a hot bath to recuperate, but as I lay in it drowsily, I reflected that the worst was yet to come. The following morning, I had to telephone Leonard to Few and try to apologize for half an acre of trampled anemones and 12 broken cloches. Isn't it delightful the way he writes?